Record calls are being made to mental health services during the second lockdown of coronavirus. Joining me now is John Brogden, the chairman of Lifeline Australia. John, thanks for your time this evening. Now, as the community continues to struggle in the midst of this pandemic, what are services like Lifeline doing to support those in need?
We've never seen the number of calls we're getting now in the history of Lifeline, in the 57-year history of Lifeline. Since the beginning of the lockdown in Victoria, you might recall almost 2 weeks ago, the lockdown of the public housing towers. And just in the few days that followed that, we saw calls coming out of Victoria increase by 22%. That's an extraordinarily large increase in such a small period of time. And those calls have continued to fluctuate around those numbers. So what we're seeing, without a doubt, is an increase in calls out of Victoria, courtesy of the lockdown. And we've seen an increase in calls over the whole period of the coronavirus, commencing in March, getting as high back at Easter as 3,200 calls a day. We usually get 2,500 calls a day. So we're there for people. We're there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week on our traditional number, 13, 11, 14, for people in need.
Now, John, as you just mentioned, we've seen a 22% spike in calls from Victoria alone in the last 4 weeks. This follows the second outbreak of the virus. This year alone, over 90,000 calls have been made to the service. What are the main issues people are facing?
Well, it's interesting. At the beginning of the lockdown, the national lockdown, we saw people expressing concerns about whether they'd get COVID or die from COVID. And we have to cast our months back 4 months, which seems like 4 years sometimes. And remember, at that stage, we were being told you're going to be locked down for 6 months and there's a high likelihood of a huge number of infections and a huge number of deaths. When it became pretty clear in a month or so after the commencement of the lockdown that that wasn't going to be the case, that infections were lower and seemed to be under control and deaths were minimal. Every death is a tragedy, but compared to what we thought they were going to be and compared to what we saw overseas, deaths in Australia were quite small, quite low. So then people's concerns changed to talk about finances and their personal financial situation. People who've lost their job, or someone in the household lost their job, or they've got a job that's paying less hours, and then what happens when JobKeeper finishes. I really should say that JobKeeper was an absolute lifesaver for people because it kept them going, it kept them getting income through the door in an extraordinary time that happened overnight. Let's not forget how quickly all of this happened and how quickly people lost their jobs and the like. So JobKeeper has saved people's lives. So I'm really pleased to see today Josh Frydenberg saying that they won't turn off the tap in September. They'll put in some form of continuation of JobKeeper because we were very concerned of two things happening to see a return to increased calls. First one's a future lockdown, and we've already seen that in Victoria. And the second one was JobKeeper falling off a cliff because that would have been extraordinarily stressful for people. So we're seeing these calls. We're seeing calls, the numbers of which we've never seen before. And we're seeing people at the moment who are mostly stressed about their future financial position once JobKeeper stops and once we go back to whatever normal is going to look like. But there certainly is a concern coming out of Victoria right now about the risk of infection and the risk of death.
Now, John, talk us through surveys that are coming in. Nationwide mental health during the height of the restrictions in Australia found mental health problems were at least twice as prevalent as in non-pandemic circumstances. In terms of services and the key messages from yourself and Lifeline, what are you saying to people around?
Well, the first thing is, right now, in these circumstances, it's all right not to be all right. You don't have to tough it through this period of time. And if you're the sort of person who ordinarily doesn't get stressed or depressed during difficult times, this may be quite different for you. And you may, for the first time in your life, feel stressed and pressured through this period of time. So it's a really important lesson that it's all right not to feel all right in these extraordinary times. My strong message, it's a personal message, it's a message from Lifeline as well, is don't suffer in silence. Please don't sit there distressed or depressed in any way thinking that people don't care. Lifeline cares, friends and family care. There are other agencies and other services, right down to and including your friends and neighbours and your GP, all of whom care to make sure you get through this period of time. So it's important to stay in contact with people. One of the interesting messages of isolation is it's good for our physical health, but it's not always good for our mental health because we're basically pushing people into a situation of loneliness. And believe it or not, there are hundreds of people who call Lifeline every day already, and Lifeline is the only voice they hear all day. The only other human voice they hear all day is Lifeline. So the risk of isolation is loneliness. And here's my other very important message. We can all play a role. Knock on your neighbour's door, see how they're going, ring a friend you know who's going to be doing it particularly tough in this period of time, yell over to the neighbour over the back fence, yell over the balcony in your apartment block, whatever it might be, reach out, because people will, in a manner that you may not even expect, be really grateful to hear from friends and family and familiar people at a really difficult time, because there will be some people who are doing it extraordinarily tough. So I try and ring somebody maybe once a day or a couple of times a week just to see how they're going, because I'm worried about them as a friend, as a family member and the like. So I encourage people to do their bit. We can all do a little bit to make a difference, to reach out to people and keep them connected.
And that's great advice. Now, middle-aged males seem to be suffering more so than others, particularly during this pandemic and the second wave that is now, of course, hitting Victoria, with some clusters in Sydney as well. Why is this?
Well, traditionally, middle-aged men are very susceptible to suicide. It's one of the larger groups. For instance, men 45 to 55 are a very large group of people who ring Lifeline as well. It's a period of men's lives when, if they lose their job, they do find it quite hard to get another job. The statistics are very clear. When men in their 50s lose their job, they can take a long time to find another job and rarely get the sort of job they had before. So they're going to have to change their expectations and change their working life as well. So this is a key group of Australians who are very heavily affected by depression, by mental illness, and ultimately by suicide. So it's traditionally been the case. It will only be worse as we see this level of stress and pressure from the second lockdown in Victoria and maybe restrictions continuing in New South Wales and other states. I'm really concerned that people will find the second lockdown much harder than the first lockdown. People will have thought to themselves back in March, well, it's going to be 6 months, but they found out it was 6 weeks or 2 months. Then the restrictions began to ease and life began to get back to normal, and then bang, out of the blue, another shutdown. So I'm worried in Victoria that there'll be some people who'll do it particularly tough because they thought they'd got through the worst of it and they're back in again. And of course, the numbers we're seeing out of Victoria are the worst we've seen since the pandemic started in Australia. So this is an even more important time for people to reach out. And my message is, don't suffer in silence. Please reach out. Please ask for help. It's there for you. Lifeline 13, 11, 14, other agencies, friends, family, GPs, whatever you can do, please don't suffer in silence.
And on that note, if you're concerned about a friend or relative, what should you do, John?
Well, Lifeline exists not just for people who are upset or depressed or suicidal themselves to ring Lifeline. It also exists for families and friends. So you might have a friend you're worried about, and you're worried about them, their behaviour's changed, they're very deep, they're very melancholy, they're not doing well. And you think to yourself, well, I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist or an expert, what do I do? Ring Lifeline, ask them what you might do, get some professional help from Lifeline to talk to a friend. If you're really worried about them, and you're really worried they might hurt themselves or take their own life, we'll get them to an emergency ward or ring 000 and get an ambulance. If things are that bad, ring 000 and they will intervene and get you through that difficult time. But really, all the old rules apply. Look after people, be kind to yourself, be kind to others, and stay in contact. And that's not just texting people or social media. Pick up the phone so they can hear a human voice. Stay in contact with them, keep them connected, and ask them how they are. That wonderful campaign that's run once a year, the Are You OK Day. This is Are You OK Year 2020. We've had droughts, fires, floods, now coronavirus. There's never been a more important time to reach out to people you know and you love and make sure they're okay.
That is some great advice. Thank you for your time, Chairman of Lifeline Australia, and thank you for all the hard work you're doing for Australians around. That's John Brogden there, Chairman of Lifeline Australia. And if you or anyone you know is feeling distressed, you can call Lifeline on 13 11 14 or visit lifeline.org.au/get help.